family JCC. My name is Zach Bodner. I'm the CEO of the JCC here. We are thrilled that you've joined us for tonight's program. And for one of the reasons is that we're trying to build something special here. Many of you have been engaged with the JCC for many years. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're really trying to become that boutique cultural arts destination. We're bringing in speakers that are cutting-edge speakers like Bret Stephens. We had Nicholas Kristof, Sheryl Sandberg. Next Monday, if you're interested, we have somebody by the name of Alan Mendoza, who runs the Henry Jackson Society. You should come next Monday night. We have Michael Chabon coming with Ayala Waldman in conversation next month. We had Yitz Greenberg yesterday. We just have phenomenal speakers, and tonight is more in that same line. So I'm thrilled that we are becoming that boutique cultural arts destination that we've always wanted to be. And I'm especially thrilled to be able to be on stage tonight and welcome the person who's going to introduce Bret Stephens, because I've had the opportunity to know Bret for many, many years. I met him back when he was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, before he was even 30 years old, and because he was an underachiever, of course. He's since, earned a Pulitzer Prize and is doing incredible things. His commentaries are riveting. Many of us read them regularly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I really just wanted to thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to thank the ZOA for bringing Bret, and I want to introduce the West Coast Director for the ZOA, Sam Levine, to come on up here and introduce our guest speaker. So thank you for being here. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. I'd first like to thank, of course, Zach Bodner, Ronit, Jen, and the rest of the staff at the Palo Alto JCC for hosting the event and for partnering with the Zionist Organization of America. Thank you so much to everyone that's helped out. And to everybody else, lots of people helped out, lots of friends. There's too many of you to name, but thank you. Now, before we get to Mr. Stephens, I would like to briefly tell you all about ZOA for those of you not familiar with us. The Zionist Organization of America is the oldest pro-Israel organization in the U.S., founded in 1897. At ZOA, we have offices around the U.S. and in Israel. At ZOA, we defend Israel in the court of public opinion, we fight anti-Semitism, and we stand up for the rights of the Jewish people. At ZOA, we are principled and unapologetic in our support for Israel. We defend Israel even when it's not politically expedient to do so. At ZOA, we're working to make sure that Jerusalem is recognized by the U.S. State Department as the capital of Israel. At ZOA, we're working to make sure that the U.S. Justice Department prosecutes foreign terrorists who kill American citizens. At ZOA, we're working to make sure that Iran is not allowed to obtain nuclear weapons. At ZOA, we are combating anti-Semitism on our college campuses. If you would like to support programs like this one tonight, please consider becoming a member of ZOA. There are forms on the table outside that you can fill out, and we accept credit cards, so you have no excuses. There's another easy way you can support the important work of ZOA. Once every 4 years, the World Zionist Congress meets in Jerusalem to make key funding and policy decisions that affect the future of Israel and Jews throughout the world. The 37th Zionist Congress will meet in October of this year. The Congress's 525 delegates from all over the world will include 145 delegates from the U.S. elected from various competing slates. Any Jewish citizen above the age of 18 years can vote online in the WZC election, and ZOA is on the ballot. It only costs $10 to vote, and this is your way to have a say in the future of the Jewish community. ZOA is running on a platform to help ensure that the Jewish Agency has the resources needed to rescue and assist Jews all over the world who are in grave danger due to rising worldwide anti-Semitism. This is an absolutely critical, life-saving priority. We're going to have computers set up outside after the event that you can vote on if you wish, and we also have material that you can take with you. And please go to votezoa.org for more information on that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a truly pivotal time for Israel and the Jewish people. President Obama is negotiating a deal with Iran that many think does not adequately address the security concerns of Israel. Anti-Semitism in Europe is rising to levels not seen since the 1930s. The neighborhood in which Israel lives is descending into sectarian war as radical Islam expands. Here with us tonight to talk about these critical issues is someone who's considered to be one of the brightest foreign policy minds in America. I am truly thrilled that we have Bret Stephens with us tonight. Bret Stephens is the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of the Wall Street Journal. He is the paper's deputy editorial page editor. He is also a regular panelist on the Journal editorial report on Fox News. Mr. Stephens joined the Journal in 1998 as an op-ed editor and moved to Brussels the following year, where he wrote editorials and edited a column on the European Union. He left Dow Jones in 2002 to become editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed, as you just heard, at the age of 28. Mr. Stephens returned to the Journal in late 2004 and has reported stories from around the globe. He has an undergraduate degree with honors from the University of Chicago and a master's from the London School of Economics. He lives in New York City with his wife, Karina, a music critic, and their 3 children. Mr. Stephens has a new book out, America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. I am currently reading it now, and it is really fascinating. I urge all of you to buy a copy after this event, where Bret will be signing copies. Now, after Bret is done speaking, we'll have some time for Q&A. We have mics set up on that side and on that side, so when he's done speaking, head down to ask him some questions, and he's happy to have a dialogue with you and a little back and forth, not too long though, because we want to get as many questions and comments as possible. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Bret Stephens.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Sam, for that very warm, lovely introduction. I do want to rectify some omissions in Sam's introduction of me. There was no mention of my role in the Osama bin Laden operation. I parachuted into Dien Bien Phu in 1954. You know about the 600 at Sevastopol. I was 601, the 301st at Thermopylae, but we're going to put all those things to one side. I don't want to boast too much about my military exploits. It's a real delight to be here in California. It's especially a pleasure and an honor to speak for the ZOA, and the ZOA is very dear to my heart for many reasons, but I want to single out one, which I think is particularly important. ZOA is not afraid to be unpopular, and I think that is probably the quality that is most desperately needed today in political discourse generally, but speaking as a Jew, in Jewish discourse particularly. It is easy to attempt to make the case for Israel, or seek to make the case for Israel, as a kind of a popularity contest. But that's not why a case for Israel needs to be made. It's not to make the Jewish cause or the cause of Israel more broadly accepted. It's to defend the truth, and it's to defend the country and to defend its people. And that's what ZOA has been doing for a very, very long time, for 50 years before the state was created, and ever since then. And so I think that really deserves to be commended. I want to begin tonight's remarks by spending a little bit of time dwelling on what has happened in Europe in just the past few weeks, beginning with the attacks in Paris, which were then had a kind of a copycat attack in Copenhagen. I expect we're probably going to see more such attacks in Madrid, other French cities, perhaps in Germany as well. I think it behooves us to really think clearly about just what has happened in France in the last few weeks, what those attacks meant. Now, let me begin by noting that at least since the attacks of September 11th, there has been a broad debate within, it's for me, there has been a broad debate within the foreign policy establishment, but I think in the United States at large, seeking to address that question, why do they hate us? Why does the Muslim world, so much of the Muslim world, I should say, seek to make war against the West? Why do they commit terrorist atrocities, not just in New York and Washington, but in Sydney, in Paris, in you name it, around the world, Madrid, London, and so on? And broadly speaking, there are two sides in that debate. The one side, you will hear people like Ron Paul, for instance, but also many people on the left, certainly the Noam Chomskys of the world, people who agree with him, that the source of hatred is a matter of Western policy. That is to say, we are hated here in the West, in the United States, because we support Israel, or because we have supported Arab dictatorships like the Mubarak regime in Egypt, or because we supported the Shah of Iran, or the rulers of Saudi Arabia, or because we went to war in Iraq, Abu Ghraib. You can all list the policies. And they make the argument that, well, if that's the cause, if the cause is the policy, the best way to ameliorate the hatred, to drain it, is to change the policy. And in fact, that is to a large extent what this administration has been seeking to do quite sedulously for the past 6 years. Change the policy, get out of Iraq, wind down our commitments in Afghanistan, have a magnificent speech in Cairo while offering a new discourse with the Muslim world, take a much more skeptical stance when it comes to the Israeli government, come down hard on the policy, on Israel's policy on settlements. And lo and behold, shortly after you make those changes, we will begin to see better relations taking place between the Muslim world and the West. So what we've been conducting for the past 6 years has been a kind of experiment in pursuit of that thesis. You can judge for yourself how it's worked out. Now, on the other side, there is a view that, in fact, it's really not about the policy. That the policy is really an alibi. Yes, it's mentioned. Osama bin Laden mentions the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia as one of the causes for his fatwa back in 1996. But it's not fundamentally about policies. It's about values. It's about the core things that our civilization believes in and how that squares with what too much of the Muslim world also believes in. I don't say all of the Muslim world, but too much of the Muslim world also believes in. And I think that when you saw those brothers attack Charlie Hebdo, a magazine that was not notorious as a mouthpiece for American neoconservatism, that had not previously been known to publish op-eds from Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Dick Cheney, that scattered its fire in all directions, not just at Muslims, but at observant Jews, at Catholic priests, you name it, that was essentially a magazine that stood for the inviolable right to be vulgar, to be scatological, to be quasi-pornographic. You had your answer. This magazine was not attacked because it was a mouthpiece for Western colonialism. This magazine was attacked simply because it insisted that if you were going to have free speech when it came to making fun of Catholics or making fun of Jews, you also had to have free speech when it came to depicting Mohammed. And for that reason,
And that reason alone, a dozen people sitting around a conference table in Paris trying to figure out the design of their forthcoming issue were murdered in cold blood. So I should hope that if the Charlie Hebdo incident settles anything, it is this question of why do they hate us? I do not think you can plausibly make the case that it's a matter of policy. And if they don't hate us because of our policies, we cannot cure that hatred by changing our policies. Now, then we had the attack, the follow-on attack. As someone put it, a random attack on a bunch of people at a deli. Folks at a deli. Well, it wasn't a random attack, and it wasn't just a bunch of folks, and it wasn't even a deli. This was an attack on Jews at a kosher supermarket or grocery, doing nothing but their shopping for Shabbat. They too were not agents of Israeli policy. They were just French Jews, Jewish citizens doing their shopping, and they were targeted, and they were slaughtered. And they were slaughtered because they were Jews. Not for any other reason. They were not slaughtered as an objection to Israeli policy in Gaza. They were not slaughtered because of building permits or the permitting process to build new construction units in Ramat Shlomo or another neighborhood of Jerusalem. They were slaughtered because they were Jews. And it should at least bring us, and it should bring Europe, into a stark confrontation to the kind of, I don't want to say anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is actually the wrong term, the kind of Jew hatred which has become so pervasive throughout Europe. But it's not enough to simply say, well, we have this Jew hatred in Europe that stems from essentially North African or Arab or Muslim immigrants. Because there's more than one kind of Jew hatred in Europe today. There is that low Jew hatred from which that killer emerged, but then there's the higher Jew hatred. And that's the Jew hatred that goes by the term, by the catchphrase of anti-Zionism, or sometimes merely strong criticism of Israeli policy. We ought to be mindful of the fact that this attack on the supermarket took place only weeks after the French Parliament had voted, albeit symbolically, voted by a large majority, I think it was 350 to 115, to recognize a Palestinian state. You have a French political culture and a media culture which is saturated not only with a pro-Palestinian view, but with a reflexive belief that Israel is acting against the Palestinians as an ogre would act against its victim. And you just have to watch the French media to see this. I was just on a panel at the French-American Foundation, and I made this point. I was with the former editor of Le Monde. I said, part of the problem here is that the French are treated to a nonstop diet in which Israeli soldiers are alleged to kill for sport Palestinian boys on a beach, to kill for sport Mohammed al-Dura, the boy caught in the crossfire, almost certainly killed, by the way, by Palestinian fire. If any of you remember that case going back to the beginning of this century. And yet they're treated to this steady diet. So you have this confluence of hatreds, the high Jew hatred and the low Jew hatred. And they've met, and they've produced what France is today. And it will not do to say, well, you have to understand that this is a reaction to upheavals in the Middle East, because as Leon Wieseltier has pointed out, I think very accurately in a few years ago, he said, if you try to explain anti-Semitism, that is to say, what people do to Jews as a function of what some other Jews have allegedly done to some other people. You're not explaining anti-Semitism or Jew hatred, you're replicating it. And that is precisely, for example, what Jimmy Carter was doing when he went on television after the attacks in Paris to say, well, part of the reason here is a reaction to the war in Gaza. So that's another lesson that we ought to draw from what happened in France, and then, of course, what later happened in Copenhagen. Now, a third point that I think is important. So we learned very quickly after the attack that at least one of the brothers who had carried out, one of the Kouachi brothers, we're not quite sure which one, who had carried out the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, had been trained in Yemen by Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, very rapidly took credit for the attack. It happens, I grew up in Mexico. My grandparents were expatriated Americans, and so my grandmother actually knew Leon Trotsky. And Leon Trotsky had some interesting things to say. One of the most marvelous of his comments that he once said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." Well, I would paraphrase Trotsky for present purposes to say, you may not be interested in the Middle East, you may not be interested in Yemen, but the Middle East and Yemen and all its furies and fanaticism is interested in you. It's interested in you if you're in Paris, but it's also interested in you ultimately if you're in Palo Alto as well. And so it ought to tell us something about this idea that is afoot in foreign policy circles, that we can somehow draw a big line around what we call the Middle East and pivot away from it. That we can simply choose not to look at what is happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Yemen, in Somalia, and say, it's all very complicated. Let's deal with something that's more interesting and more manageable, like relations between Japan and China. Because that too has been a part of foreign policy in the United States for the past few years. The idea is, we're so sick of the Middle East, we're never going to solve its problems, let's simply look away. Well, we are discovering, and this is, if I may offer an advertisement for this fantastically written book. It's called American Retreat, but the working title is 49 Shades of Grey, so you really need to read well into it to get to the really juicy, racy bits. Don't be deterred by the grim-sounding title. But we need to realize, if we haven't already, that if we are going to create a power vacuum in Iraq, in Syria, in other places in the Middle East, that vacuum is going to be filled. And it's not going to be filled by the UN. It's not going to be filled by humanitarian NGOs. It's not going to be filled by the brotherhood and sisterhood of man. It's going to be filled by ambitious, willful, violent, totalitarian, nihilistic, fanatical, and murderous organizations. The more so, the more they are all those things, the more effective they are going to be. And so we are now living in a world in which ISIS, the Islamic State, it should be called Islamic Caliphate, because that in fact is what it is. A state has borders. A caliphate does not have borders. A caliphate's borders are the globes. We are living in a world in which these groups are not only taking root, they're metastasizing. Islamic State controls a territory larger than the United Kingdom today. Bear that in mind, 8 million people. It has declared itself as a caliphate. It has attracted at least 20,000 foreign fighters, some 5,000 of whom we think are European, several hundred of whom may be American. If they have European passports, they have visa-free. They typically have visa-free access to the United States. Between 2010 and 2013, when the tide of war was receding, according to one supposedly authoritative source, and Al-Qaeda was on a path to defeat according to the same authoritative source, and it was time for nation building at home, once again according to that same authoritative source. The RAND Corporation calculated that the number of jihadist fighters around the world had doubled from about 50,000 to 100,000. It has probably doubled again since then. The number of jihadist groups, the Martyrs Brigade of this, and the other, rose by 58%. And the lesson is that when you create power vacuums, those vacuums get filled. When America goes into retreat, bad things tend to happen. And that is what we're seeing throughout the Middle East. Now, most visibly, we're seeing it in the case of Islamic State. Now, I hesitate to call it Islamic because they are merely violent extremists, and I wouldn't want to dignify them. Apparently, people who work for PETA could also be categorized, according to some accounts, as violent extremists, at least if they do damage to shampoo factories. Islamic State is the only mistake in its name is that it is not a state. It is a caliphate. But it is profoundly Islamic. And we cannot conduct foreign policy as if we are in a Harry Potter novel, pitting good against he who must not be named. This reference is lost on some people in this room. And if you have children my age, it is not lost. You cannot fight an enemy that you can't describe. No, Islamic State does not represent all Muslims. It doesn't represent a majority of Muslims. It doesn't even represent a small minority of Muslims. But to suggest it isn't Islamic is both presumptuous on our part and profoundly untrue. It is a fundamentalist, Salafist, Islamic group that lives by the letter of the Quran. And anyone who studies its methods, its vision, its aim, and who has any familiarity with Islamic texts understands this. If you don't believe me, there's a wonderful article in The Atlantic that makes this point very, very compellingly and convincing. But this is what we're dealing with now in Islamic State. And we have a problem because we are so reluctant to call it Islamic, because we're so reluctant to name it for what it is, or Islamist, if you prefer. Because we're doing that, we are, in effect, fighting, as they say, with one hand tied behind our back. During the Cold War, people like Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy and other Cold Warriors didn't say, oh, we're just fighting a bunch of militants in the Kremlin, right? Don't call them communists, because communism is a wonderful philosophy that professes the brotherhood of man, and they're a terrible perversion of communism, right? We called them communists, and we fought the ideology. And we explained what was wrong with it, and we made the case for capitalism, for liberalism, for democracy. But there is no way we can do something like that against a group like Islamic State if we are not even conceding that they stand for something, that they are representing a philosophical point of view, that they actually exist in a kind of philosophical context, the classic battle between ancients and moderns, between politics centered on virtue and politics centered on freedom. And so because we are not waging this fight, we are surprised when groups like Islamic State are drawing tens of thousands, if not more, young Muslims to its banner. Why are they doing it? Because Islamic State is making certain fundamental claims. And we're saying, well, what's necessary is more jobs and better governance. No, what's necessary is a robust defense and explanation of liberal values and what they're about, along with a demonstration that not only are liberal values better when it comes to questions of virtue and justice, But liberalism is more effective when it comes to fighting wars. And when you're dropping 4 bombs a day over an area the size of the United Kingdom, you're not going to make that claim succeed. Right now, Islamic State is the strong horse. We are the weak horse in that region, and we are seeing it every day. Now, we talk about Islamic State all the time because obviously we're obsessed with it, and you see these incredible images from the crucifixions, the decapitations, and everything else they're doing, which makes us momentarily imagine that Iran, a country that executes one person roughly every 7 hours, is this relatively reasonable and moderate state that we can somehow do business with. As in the 1930s, so too today, we are faced with twin evils. 2 groups that, for all of their differences, represent a common threat to everything that it is that we believe in. And, so we talk about Iran, and say, it's a country with interests, and we can negotiate with them, and Mohammad Zarif seems like such a nice and reasonable guy. We're gonna have a dialogue with them. And Hassan Rouhani is the moderate president of Iran. Let's not forget that Iran's nuclear program actually began or reached its fruition under Khatami, the last moderate president of Iran, which tells you something about Iranian moderates. But let's not forget that the reason we are opposed to an Iran with a nuclear weapon, well, there are many reasons. There's a proliferation risk. There's everything Iran says about Israel. But fundamentally, we're opposed to it because a regime that can take a stone in one hand and stone a woman to death should not be given a nuclear weapon in its other hand to do analogously with some of its neighbors. That's the point. And I say this, by the way, to the liberals in this audience. It's not the conservative case against Iran. It's not some general case against nuclear weapons, generically speaking. Francois Hollande has his finger on the button. David Cameron has his finger on the button. Benjamin Netanyahu has his finger on the button. Nobody worries that they're going to wake up in the morning in a bad mood and decide to start an apocalypse. But you do worry about Iran because Iran talks about it. Because central to much of Iranian theology, or its governing theology, is this millenarian and apocalyptic vision. Because the former president of Iran, who today is described as a moderate, Rafsanjani, said clearly in 2001, all of Israel's nuclear weapons would only harm the Muslim world, but one bomb on Tel Aviv would destroy the Jewish state. And this, as he put it, it's not inconceivable to think of that eventuality, of that possibility. That's why we oppose Iran with a nuclear weapon. So we come to Iran, and we say, well, the Iranians. Iran is now boasting that it controls 4 Arab capitals: Damascus, Baghdad, Beirut, and now Sana'a. I don't think people appreciate what an epic strategic reversal we are facing. People talk about the Houthi as if they are some tribe. The Houthi are not a tribe. The Houthi is Yemen's Hezbollah. The motto of the Houthi is death to Islam, death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. This is not a tribal vision, this is an ideological vision. And they are funded and supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Quds Force. You now have a situation in which Iran sits on top of the 2 waterways that control the Arabian Peninsula. The Strait of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf, and then the strait separating the Arabian Peninsula from the African continent. And Iran controls both access points. This is the strategic threat that we now face from an Iran that is not exactly negotiating with us as if it fears an imminent American military strike in the event that negotiation fails. On the contrary, the Iranians know perfectly well that when this administration says that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, they mean it. That is to say, the administration means it in roughly the same way that when I tell my 5-year-old that her behavior is unacceptable, she knows perfectly well I don't mean it. I will not be bombing my daughter for her misbehavior at the dinner table. And the Iranians know that about the United States too. They know that about this administration. They have taken this administration's measure. If they were so afraid of the sanctions that Obama pretends to threaten, we would not now be in the third period of what was supposed to be a 6-month interim deal. The Iranians would not be acting like they have the whip hand in this negotiation if they felt they had anything to fear from the United States. They are perfectly good. Look, dictatorships are bad at many things. They're bad at managing economies. They're often bad at organizing armies. But to be a successful dictator, you need one skill. One skill which defines a successful dictatorship. You need to be able to spot and exploit the weakness of your adversary. And the Iranians are masters at that. And that is what they have seen in this administration. And that's how they're dealing with us. That is why I think the next 23 months are uniquely dangerous for the United States, for Israel, and indeed for the whole world. Because for the next 23 months, not just the Iranians, but Vladimir Putin and every other American adversary knows they are dealing with an American administration that wants nothing more than simply to look away. It wants nothing more to say, let's not overstate the threat. We are waking up every day to a new geopolitical crisis. If the Houthis control northern Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula controls southern Yemen. We are looking at Islamic State putting down its roots in Libya, and Libya becoming another source of global jihad just on the southern side of the Mediterranean Sea. We are seeing Hezbollah further entrench itself in Lebanon, in Syria. We are seeing Bashar Assad winning his war, at least winning his corner, in Syria, defying the United States. We are seeing Vladimir Putin outplay us every single time, not only when it comes to Ukraine, but when it comes to the rest of Russia's neighbors. And you have an administration that says, let's look away, let's not overstate the threat. What we need is, as the new national security document put it, we need strategic patience. Strategic patience is a high-toned euphemism for doing as little as humanly possible and getting away with it politically. So while we're exercising strategic patience, our enemies are eating our lunch, and this is a worrying thing. And it is particularly worrying, excuse me, if you happen to be a small country on the front line between the free and the unfree world. And one of the things that's interesting for me is, never mind the Israel side of it, I talk to senior diplomats, military officials from Taiwan, Vietnamese, Philippines, various places around the world, the Estonians, the Latvians, and they're all saying the same thing. They're all saying, where did the United States go? It's interesting that 10 years ago, America was this horrendously overbearing ogre, right? That didn't even speak English grammatically, much less a foreign